Could you survive a night shift at an abandoned Texas hospital where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper carries a warning? I just started, and the rules are chilling. Don't look into patient rooms, and if you hear your name, don't answer. This isn't just about clocking in. It's about making it to sunrise. Do you think you have what it takes to last a single night? The cracked asphalt beneath my boots crunched like broken bones as I approached St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital for the first time. The November wind cut through the Texas plains, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something that made my skin crawl without understanding why. The job posting had been vague, almost suspiciously so. Night security position available. Minimal supervision. Must be comfortable with solitude. Previous experience preferred, but not required. Excellent pay for the right candidate. When you're 3 months behind on rent and living off ramen noodles, you don't ask too many questions about excellent pay. But standing here now, watching the dying light of dusk paint the hospital's broken windows in shades of amber and blood, I wondered if I should have been more curious about why they were paying 3 times the going rate for a security guard. The building loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to suffering. St. Catherine's had been shuttered for nearly 15 years, ever since that incident nobody liked to talk about. The locals just called it "What Happened in '08" and changed the subject when pressed. All I knew was that one night, the hospital had simply stopped. No gradual closure, no transfer of patients, just an immediate evacuation that left medical equipment still humming in empty rooms until the power company finally cut the lines. Now, as I stood at the main entrance, the massive structure seemed to exhale the accumulated misery of decades. 7 stories of crumbling concrete and shattered dreams, each for a testament to the thin line between healing and horror. The architectural style was brutalist, all harsh angles and oppressive geometry, designed in an era when hospitals were built to last rather than comfort. But time had not been kind to St. Catherine's. Ivy crawled up the walls like seeking fingers, and several windows on the upper floors had been boarded up with plywood that now warped and split, revealing glimpses of the darkness within. The main entrance doors stood partially ajar, held open by a brick someone had wedged between them. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, and a faded sign reading "Emergency Entrance" hung at an odd angle, secured by a single remaining screw. Through the gap, I could see only darkness, thick and impenetrable as velvet. I checked my phone one more time, hoping for a text from the hiring manager, Marcus, giving me some last-minute instructions, or maybe even telling me there'd been a mistake and I could go home. But the screen showed only "no service" in the corner where the signal bars should be. Of course, even the cell towers seemed to want nothing to do with this place. Taking a deep breath that tasted of rust and regret, I pushed through the entrance doors. They swung open with a prolonged creak that echoed through the lobby like a warning. The sound seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have, as if the building itself was reluctant to let it fade. The lobby was a cathedral of abandonment. Dust motes danced in the weak beams of light that filtered through the grimy windows, performing their eternal, pointless ballet. The reception desk stood like an altar to better times, its surface buried under years of accumulated debris. Old newspapers, yellowed medical forms, and what looked like children's drawings, their crayon colors faded to ghost pale pastels. Above the reception desk, a large wooden cross still hung on the wall, though it now tilted at a precarious angle. St. Catherine's had been a Catholic hospital, run by an order of nuns who believed that healing the body and saving the soul were inseparable missions. The religious iconography remained throughout the building. Crucifixes, paintings of saints, small shrines tucked into alcoves. But now, in the gathering darkness, these symbols of comfort and protection seemed to watch with hollow eyes, as if they too had abandoned their posts. The smell hit me next. a complex cocktail of disinfectant and decay that seemed to coat my throat with each breath. Underneath it all was something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of a place where too many people had died, where grief had seeped into the very walls and never dried. As I stood in that lobby, trying to adjust to the oppressive atmosphere, I became aware of a sound that would haunt me for weeks to come. It was subtle at first, just at the edge of hearing, a rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming against glass. Or maybe it was pipes settling in the walls. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that didn't want to be identified. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the tile floors and disappearing into the shadowed corridors that stretched away from the lobby like the arms of a dying spider. Each hallway promised its own unique brand of horror, lined with patient rooms whose doors stood ajar, just enough to suggest the possibility of occupancy. But here's what really made my blood run cold. In all that vast, echoing space, I felt watched, not by cameras or security systems, but by something more primal, more patient. It was the feeling of being studied, evaluated, cataloged for future reference. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every doorway held the potential for movement that would vanish the moment I turned my head. I forced myself to walk deeper into the lobby, my footsteps impossibly loud in the silence. Near the elevators, I found a small security office that looked like it had been hastily abandoned. The door stood open, and inside, a desk held the remnants of someone's last shift. A half-empty coffee cup with mold growing on the surface, a newspaper dated 3 months ago, and a small stack of incident reports that I didn't have the courage to read. But it was what I found in the desk drawer that truly made my hand shake. A laminated card, obviously official, with St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital letterhead. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Night Shift Protocols, Mandatory Compliance." Below that, a list of rules that made no sense and all the sense in the world at the same time. As I read through them, that tapping sound grew louder, more insistent, and I began to understand that this wasn't just a job. This was a test of survival, and I was about to find out if I was strong enough to pass it. The building seemed to settle around me as full darkness fell outside, and somewhere in the distance, I heard what might have been a door closing or opening. In a place like St. Catherine's, it was impossible to tell which possibility was worse. The laminated card trembled in my hands as I read the title again. Night Shift Protocols, Mandatory Compliance. The fluorescent light in the security office flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows across the text that made the words seem to crawl and shift. But I forced myself to focus, to read each rule carefully. Because even in those first few minutes at St. Catherine's, I understood that these weren't suggestions. They were the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming another story the locals would refuse to tell. Rule number 1. Never acknowledge sounds that are not directly from a human voice calling your name. The building makes many noises. Pipes, wind, settling foundations. These are normal. Other sounds are not. Do not investigate. Do not respond. Do not let curiosity overcome survival. I paused after reading this first rule, listening to the ambient sounds of the hospital around me. That rhythmic tapping I noticed in the lobby continued, joined now by what sounded like wheels rolling across linoleum somewhere on an upper floor. The rule said pipes and wind were normal, but how was I supposed to distinguish between normal settling and something else? And what exactly was this something else I was supposed to ignore? Rule number 2. The third floor is completely off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. During these hours, do not use the elevator to access this floor. Do not use the stairwells that lead to the third floor. If you hear activity from the third floor during this time, refer to rule number 1. Previous security personnel who violated this rule have been terminated from employment immediately. The clinical language couldn't hide the underlying threat. Terminated from employment felt like a euphemism, especially given the way it was phrased. Not quit or resigned, but terminated. The word carried the weight of finality, of something irreversible. I found myself looking up at the ceiling, trying to count floors, trying to imagine what could be on the third floor that required such specific restrictions. Rule number 3. Patient rooms are to remain undisturbed. Do not enter patient rooms for any reason. Do not look into patient rooms through doorways or windows. If you see movement in a patient room, refer to rule number 1. Some rooms may appear occupied. This is normal. Some rooms may appear occupied. This is normal. The matter-of-fact tone of that statement made my skin crawl. How could occupied rooms be normal in an abandoned hospital? What did appear occupied even mean? And why was it so important not to look? Rule number 4. The chapel on the second floor is a safe zone between the hours of 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. If you feel threatened or unsafe, proceed to the chapel immediately. Do not run. Walk calmly and with purpose. The chapel doors will be unlocked during these hours only. The existence of a safe zone implied the existence of genuine danger. This wasn't just about trespassing or vandalism. There was something in this hospital that required sanctuary. The specificity of the hours troubled me. What happened at 4 a.m. that made the chapel no longer safe? Rule number 5. If the elevator begins moving without being called, do not attempt to stop it. Do not investigate which floor it stops on. Continue with your rounds as if nothing has happened. The elevator has been decommissioned, but sometimes still functions. This is normal. A decommissioned elevator that sometimes still functions and moves on its own. The word normal was becoming a mockery, a thin veneer over something deeply abnormal. I made a mental note to avoid the elevators entirely, regardless of the rules. Rule number 6. Your radio will occasionally pick up transmissions that do not come from the security company. These transmissions may sound distressing or urgent. Do not respond to these transmissions. Do not act on any instructions given through these transmissions. Report these incidents in your log, but take no action. The idea of false radio transmissions added another layer of psychological horror. Not only did I have to ignore strange sounds and sights, but I couldn't trust my only connection to the outside world. What kind of transmissions were they talking about? And who, or what, will be sending them? Rule number 7. The basement level requires special permission to access. Your key card will not work on the basement doors without authorization. Do not attempt to force these doors open. Do not attempt to access the basement through other means. Some areas are better left undisturbed. Some areas are better left undisturbed. The understatement of the century. Whatever was in the basement was so dangerous or disturbing that they'd made it impossible to access accidentally. The fact that they felt the need to specifically warn against forcing the doors open suggested that others had tried. Rule number 8. Night shift begins at 10 p.m. and ends at 6 a.m. Do not arrive early. Do not stay late. The hospital is not safe outside of these hours, and security coverage is not provided before or after this time frame. Even the security company that employed me didn't want their people in this building longer than necessary. The idea that the hospital was somehow safer during my shift than outside, it was deeply unsettling. What happened here during the day that was worse than whatever I was about to face at night? Rule number 9. In case of emergency, the nearest hospital is St. Mary's, 23 miles south. Ambulance response time to St. Catherine's is approximately 35 minutes. Plan accordingly. The clinical nature of this rule was perhaps the most terrifying of all. It acknowledged that emergencies were not just possible, but expected. 35 minutes might as well be 35 hours if something went wrong in this place. Rule number 10. Document all incidents in your security log, but remember that your job is observation only. Do not attempt to intervene in any situation you may witness. Your survival depends on remaining an observer. Your survival depends on remaining an observer, not your employment or your safety. your survival. The rule implied that I might witness things that every instinct would tell me to stop, to help with, to investigate. But my job was to watch and document, like some kind of supernatural stenographer recording events for an audience I would never meet. As I finished reading the rules, I noticed a handwritten addendum at the bottom of the card, scrawled in fading blue ink. Trust the rules. They were written in blood and learned through loss. Marcus, my hiring manager, had written this personal note, and the tremor in his handwriting was visible even in the poor light. I remembered his voice during our brief phone interview, how he'd paused for long moments between questions, how he'd asked 3 times if I was sure I wanted the position. Now I understood why. I looked at my watch. 9:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, my shift would officially begin, and I would have to put these rules to the test. The building around me seemed to sense my growing understanding, and the ambient sounds grew louder, more complex. Somewhere in the distance, I heard what might have been a door slamming, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in an empty hallway. But according to rule number 1, I wasn't supposed to acknowledge sounds that weren't directly human voices calling my name. So I sat in that small security office, surrounded by the evidence of previous guards' hasty departures, and pretended not to hear the sounds of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital coming alive for the night shift. The fluorescent light above me flickered one more time and went out, leaving me in darkness with only the emergency lighting to guide me. In that red-tinged gloom, the rules in my hands seemed less like guidelines and more like a prayer, a desperate plea to some uncaring universe to let me survive until dawn. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken windows and making the entire building groan like something in pain. But I knew now that the wind was the least of my concerns. The real danger was already inside, had always been inside, waiting patiently for another night guard to test their resolve against the accumulated darkness of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. At exactly 10 p.m., my radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. Night shift beginning. Good luck. Then silence. And in that silence, I began my first night in hell. The emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red, transforming the hospital corridors into something that belonged more in a horror movie than reality. I've been walking my rounds for 2 hours now, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a sword through velvet, and every step reinforced my growing certainty that the rules weren't just guidelines. They were the only thing standing between me and something unspeakable. My first real test of rule number 1 came at 11:23 p.m. as I was checking the second floor nurse's station. I'd been documenting the usual signs of decay and abandonment: overturned chairs, scattered papers, a computer monitor with a spider web crack across the screen, when I heard it. A music box melody, tinkling and delicate, drifting from somewhere deeper in the hospital. It was playing Fur Elise, but the melody was wrong somehow, distorted, as if the mechanism was broken or the box was underwater. The sound was hauntingly beautiful and completely out of place in the abandoned hospital. Every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to find the source of the music, and understand why a music box would be playing in an empty building. But rule number 1 was explicit. Never acknowledge sounds that are not directly from a human voice calling your name. I forced myself to continue writing in my security log, my pen scratching across the paper while the melody continued to play. The music seemed to be coming from the pediatric ward, and I could picture a small music box sitting on a dusty windowsill, its ballerina spinning endlessly in the darkness. But I didn't look. I didn't investigate. I documented the incident as music heard on second floor, 11:23 p.m., no action taken per protocol, and moved on. The music followed me for the next 10 minutes, always just at the edge of hearing, before finally fading away like a memory. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt heavy and expectant, as if the building itself was disappointed by my lack of curiosity. But my adherence to rule number 1 was rewarded with survival. And as I continued my rounds, I began to understand that the rules were less about blind obedience and more about recognizing the fundamental nature of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. This wasn't a dead building. It was something else entirely, something that existed in the space between life and death, between the world of the living and whatever comes after. The next test came as I approached midnight. I'd been carefully avoiding the stairwells that led to the 3rd floor, but I couldn't help noticing the differences in atmosphere as I passed them. Near the main stairwell, the temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. The emergency lighting flickered more frequently, and there was a smell, not the usual hospital scent of disinfectant and decay, but something organic and warm, like fresh bread or vanilla candles. At 11:58 p.m., I positioned myself in the 2nd floor hallway, where I could see the stairwell entrance, but maintain a safe distance. I had my log ready, my pen poised, and my radio turned down low. According to rule number 2, the 3rd floor became off limits at midnight, and I wanted to document whatever happened during this transition. As the second hand on my watch swept past the 12, something changed in the hospital. The ambient sounds, the creaking, the settling, the distant tapping, all stopped at once, creating a silence so complete it felt like being inside a tomb. For exactly 30 seconds, St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital held its breath. Then, at 12 hours and 30 seconds, I heard footsteps on the 3rd floor. Not the random creaking of old wood or the settling of foundations, but deliberate, measured footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking the hallways directly above me, their pace steady and purposeful. The footsteps were accompanied by other sounds, doors opening and closing, what sounded like conversations in voices too low to understand, and occasionally, the distinct sound of medical equipment being wheeled across linoleum floors. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible. The 3rd floor had been sealed for years, and there was no way anyone could be up there conducting whatever this was. But the sounds were undeniable, and they painted a picture of a fully operational hospital floor, complete with staff, patients, and the routine bustle of medical care. I documented everything I heard. 12:01 a.m., footsteps on 3rd floor, multiple individuals. 12:03 a.m., door sounds, possible conversation. 12:07 a.m., equipment movement, wheels on floor. My handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the activity above intensified, but I forced myself to remain focused on observation and documentation. At 12:15 a.m., I heard something that nearly broke my resolve entirely. A child was crying on the 3rd floor, the sound of genuine distress and fear that cut straight to my heart. The crying was accompanied by what sounded like a woman's voice, soft and comforting, trying to soothe the child. It was such a human sound, so full of real emotion and need, that I actually took 3 steps toward the stairwell before catching myself. Rule number 2 was absolute. The 3rd floor was off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. No exceptions, no matter what I heard. I forced myself to return to my position in the hallway and continue documenting, even as the child's crying grew more desperate and the comforting voice became more urgent. This went on for 47 minutes. 47 minutes of listening to what sounded like a functioning hospital floor while knowing that it was impossible, while following rules that demanded. I ignored the evidence of my own senses. By the time the activity finally began to fade around 12:47 a.m., I was shaking uncontrollably, and my log looked like it had been written during an earthquake. But the worst part wasn't the sounds themselves. It was the moment they stopped. At exactly 12:48 a.m., the footsteps, the conversations, the medical equipment, and even the crying child all fell silent at once. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than a mysterious activity had been, because it suggested that whatever was happening on the third floor was aware of being observed. It knew I was down here, listening, documenting, following my rules like a good little security guard. The silence stretched on for 5 full minutes before the normal ambient sounds of the building resumed. The creaking, the settling, the distant tapping that I'd learned to recognize as the hospital's baseline level of wrongness. But now those sounds felt almost comforting compared to the deliberate, organized activity I just witnessed. I spent the remaining hours of my shift in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, analyzing every shadow, waiting for the next test of my resolve. It came at 3:17 a.m. when I was checking the ground floor cafeteria. As I swept my flashlight across the abandoned serving line, the beam caught something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A figure was standing in the kitchen doorway, just at the edge of my light's reach. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a nurse's uniform from decades past. The figure stood perfectly still, and I couldn't make out any facial features in the darkness, but I could feel its attention focused on me with laser intensity. My first instinct was to call out, to demand identification, to ask what they were doing in an abandoned hospital in the middle of the night. But rule number 1 held me back. This wasn't a human voice calling my name. This was something else, something that had no business being here, something that was testing whether I would break protocol. I slowly moved my flashlight beam away from the figure, pretending not to have seen it, and continued documenting the cafeteria as if nothing had happened. My hands shook so badly I could barely write, and sweat dripped from my forehead despite the cold air. But I maintained the fiction that I was alone in the building. When I finally worked up the courage to shine my light back toward the kitchen doorway, 10 minutes later, the figure was gone. But I could still feel its presence somewhere in the darkness, watching, evaluating, deciding whether I was worth keeping around or if I would join the ranks of security personnel who had been terminated from employment immediately. The rest of my shift passed without major incident, though I continued to hear occasional sounds that rule number 1 demanded I ignore. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing, and once, what sounded like a child's laughter echoing from the abandoned pediatric ward. Each sound was a test, a challenge to my commitment to survival over curiosity. As dawn approached and the red emergency lighting began to pale against the growing natural light from outside, I realized that I had survived my first night at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. I had followed the rules, documented everything, and maintained my role as observer rather than participant in whatever supernatural drama played out in these corridors every night. But as I prepared to leave the building at exactly 6 a.m., I understood that this was just the beginning. The hospital had tested me tonight and found me worthy of continued employment. The real question was whether I would be able to maintain this level of discipline night after night, or if eventually curiosity and human nature would overcome my survival instincts. As I walked toward the exit, my radio crackled one final time. Night shift complete. See you tomorrow. The voice was different from the one that had welcomed me at the start of my shift, older and sadder, tinged with something that might have been regret. I didn't respond. Rule number 6 warned against responding transmissions. But as I stepped out into the growing daylight, I wondered how many other night guards had heard that same farewell and how many of them had actually made it home to hear it again. 3 weeks into my employment at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, I had developed what I thought was an unshakable routine. Follow the rules. Document everything. Don't investigate. Survive until dawn. It had worked perfectly for 21 consecutive nights, and I'd grown almost comfortable with the building's supernatural rhythms. The phantom sounds, the impossible third-floor activity, the occasional glimpses of figures that shouldn't exist. All of this had become my new normal. But St. Catherine's wasn't done testing me, and on my 22nd night, my carefully maintained discipline finally cracked. It started at 11:47 p.m. as I was conducting my hourly check of the first floor emergency department. The automatic doors at the ambulance entrance, which had been permanently disabled for over a decade, suddenly hissed open with a burst of hydraulic pressure. Through the opening, I saw not the empty parking lot I expected, but something impossible: an active ambulance bay, complete with flashing lights, emergency vehicles, and what appeared to be a medical team rushing a patient on a gurney. The scene was backlit by harsh fluorescent lighting that cast everything in stark, clinical detail. I could see the EMT performing chest compressions, could hear the urgent voices calling out medical terminology, could smell the antiseptic and blood that always accompany trauma cases. It was so real, so immediate, that for a moment I forgot where I was, forgot that this was an abandoned hospital, forgot about the rules entirely. The patient on a gurney was a child, no more than 8 years old, with dark hair matted with blood, and wearing a Manchester United soccer jersey that was torn and stained. As the medical team rushed past my hiding spot behind an overturned wheelchair, the child's eyes opened and looked directly at me. They were blue, impossibly blue, and filled with terror and pleading. "Help me," the child whispered, the words carrying across the impossible distance between us. "Please, I'm scared." Rule number 1 crumbled in that moment. This was a human voice, calling to me directly, begging for help. Everything I'd learned about the hospital, all my carefully maintained skepticism about the supernatural activity, evaporated in the face of a dying child's plea for assistance. I stepped forward, breaking every protocol I'd followed for 3 weeks. The moment my foot crossed the threshold of the ambulance bay, the scene vanished like smoke. The emergency vehicles, the medical team, the fluorescent lighting, all of it disappeared, leaving me standing in the dark, empty parking lot with nothing but the November wind and the sound of my own panicked breathing. But the damage was done. I had broken rule number 1, had acknowledged and responded something that wasn't what it appeared to be. As I stood there in the darkness, trying to process what had just happened, I heard the sound of the automatic doors closing behind me with a finality that suggested I might not be able to get back in. When I turned around, my key card wouldn't work. The little red light on the door scanner blinked mockingly, denying me access to the building where I was supposed to be working. I tried every entrance I could find, the main doors, the emergency exits, even the loading dock, but none of my credentials worked anymore. It was as if the hospital itself had decided I was no longer welcome. Panic set in as I realized the implications. My shift wasn't over for more than 6 hours, and I was locked out of the building with no way to complete my rounds, no way to document the incident, and no way to follow the remaining rules that had kept me safe for 3 weeks. According to rule number 8, the hospital wasn't safe outside of the night shift hours. But what was I supposed to do when the hospital wouldn't let me inside during those hours? I spent the next 20 minutes circling the building, trying every door, every window, every possible point of entry. The hospital loomed above me like a judgment, its broken windows reflecting the pale moonlight like accusatory eyes. Finally, in desperation, I found myself at the service entrance near the basement level, where a single door stood slightly ajar. I knew immediately that this was wrong. The basement was mentioned specifically in rule number 7. Special permission required. No unauthorized access. Some areas better left undisturbed. But what choice did I have? I was locked out of the rest of the building, and the alternative was abandoning my post entirely, something that would certainly result in the kind of termination that the rules warned about. The service door opened with a rusty groan that echoed through the darkness beyond. The smell that wafted out was indescribable. Not just the usual hospital scent, but something older and more organic like earth and flowers, and something else that made my stomach clench with primitive fear. But I forced myself forward, because the basement was part of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, and if I couldn't access the upper floors, at least I could complete some version of my security rounds. The basement corridor was different from the rest of the building. where the upper floors were all harsh angles and institutional efficiency. The basement felt organic, almost cave-like. The walls were older brick rather than concrete blocks, and they seemed to curve slightly, as if following some natural contour rather than architectural planning. My flashlight beam revealed doors made of heavy wood with iron hardware, more like something from a medieval castle than a modern hospital. Most of the doors were locked, but one stood open about halfway down the corridor. Above the doorway, a faded sign read, "Chapel Storage Private." The door opened easily when I pushed it, revealing a space that defied the basement's cramped confines. The room beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. It was filled with religious artifacts, statues, paintings, ornate crosses, and dozens of votive candles that flickered with impossible flames, casting dancing shadows across walls covered in religious iconography. At the center of the room stood an altar, and on the altar lay something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the child from the ambulance bay. The same dark hair, the same Manchester United jersey, the same impossible blue eyes. But now those eyes were closed, and the child lay perfectly still on the altar like some kind of offering. Around the altar, figures in nuns' habits knelt in prayer, their lips moving in silent supplication to whatever power they served. I should have left immediately. Every instinct, every rule, every lesson learned in 3 weeks of survival screamed at me to back away and find another route to complete my rounds. But the child looked so small, so vulnerable, and I found myself stepping into the room before I could stop myself. "Excuse me," I called out to the praying figures. "Is that child okay? Do you need medical assistance?" The nuns stopped praying in perfect unison, their heads turning toward me with movements that were too fluid, too coordinated, too inhuman. When they raised their faces, I saw that where their eyes should have been were only empty sockets, dark and bottomless as wells. "You broke the rules," they said in perfect harmony, their voices like whispers in a confessional. "You acknowledged what should not be acknowledged. You entered what should not be entered. You questioned what should not be questioned." The child on the altar opened those impossible blue eyes and smiled at me, and I realized with horror that this wasn't a child at all. It was something wearing the shape of a child, something that had used my own compassion and human decency as bait to lure me into breaking the very rules that protected me. "The rules exist for a reason," the thing wearing the child's face said, its voice now layered with harmonics that hurt my ears. "They were written in blood and learned through loss. Every night guard who came before you learned this eventually. Every one of them thought they could be the exception." The nuns rose from their kneeling positions with that same unnatural fluidity, and I saw that their habits were stained with dark patches that might have been blood or might have been something worse. They began to move toward me, not walking, but gliding across the floor like shadows given form. "But we are patient," the child thing continued. "We understand human nature. We know that compassion is both your greatest strength and your fatal weakness. So we wait, and we test, and eventually you all come to us." I ran. There's no dignity in admitting it, no heroism in the act. But I turned and fled from that impossible basement chapel as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me, I heard laughter, not just from the child thing and the eyeless nuns, but from the building itself, as if St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital was enjoying my terror. The corridor seemed longer on the way out, stretching endlessly ahead of my flashlight beam. The doors that had been closed when I entered were now open, revealing glimpses of horrors that I refused to acknowledge. Operating rooms where surgery was being performed on empty tables. Patient rooms where visitors mourned at beds that held nothing but shadows. And nurseries where cribs rocked gently, though they contained no occupants. I burst out of the service door and into the parking lot, gasping for air and fighting the urge to vomit. But my terror was far from over, because as I looked up at the hospital building, I saw that every light on every floor was now blazing, transforming St. Catherine's from a dark ruin into something that looked almost alive. Figures moved in the windows: doctors, nurses, patients, visitors, all going about their business as if the hospital had never closed, as if 15 years of abandonment had been nothing but a bad dream. And on the third floor, which should have been off limits for another hour and a half, I could see them clearly. The medical team from the ambulance bay, still working frantically to save a patient that didn't exist. My radio crackled to life. Your employment has been terminated, effective immediately. Please surrender your key card and security equipment to the main desk. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. But it wasn't Marcus's voice on the radio or the voice of anyone from the security company. It was my own voice, talking to me from some impossible future or parallel timeline where I'd already failed, already been consumed by whatever force controlled St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. I threw the radio to the ground and ran to my car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, my headlights swept across the hospital one final time, and I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Every person in every window was now looking directly at me, their faces pressed against the glass, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization as they spoke words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. See you tomorrow night. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the Texas countryside, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced in the basement of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyeless nuns, that thing wearing a child's face, the impossible tableau of medical care being performed on emptiness. The rational part of my mind kept trying to rationalize it all. Hallucinations brought on by stress, sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion in a creepy environment. But my body knew better. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every shadow seemed to hide something that shouldn't exist. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I finally pulled into a truck stop diner 30 miles from the hospital. The normalcy of the place, the smell of coffee and bacon, the chatter of early morning commuters, the blessed mundanity of fluorescent lights and vinyl booths, felt like a sanctuary after the horrors I'd witnessed. I ordered coffee and sat in a corner booth, trying to process what had happened and what it meant for my future. According to the voice on the radio, my own voice, speaking from some impossible timeline, my employment had been terminated. But terminated by whom? The security company that had hired me, or something else entirely? And what exactly did terminated mean in the context of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital? My phone, which had shown no signal for weeks whenever I was near the hospital, suddenly buzzed with a text message. The sender was listed as Marcus, but the message made my blood run cold. Rules are not suggestions. They are survival protocols. Every guard who came before you learned this too late. You have 24 hours to decide. Return and follow the rules perfectly, or face the consequences of abandonment. The hospital does not like to be left understaffed. I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it over and over again. The implication was clear. I could try to quit, to walk away from St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital forever, but whatever controlled that place wouldn't let me go easily. I was trapped between two impossible choices: return to a job that had already proven deadly to my sanity and possibly my soul, or face consequences that I could only imagine. But there was a third option, one that the message hadn't explicitly ruled out. I could return, but this time I would be prepared. I would follow the rules absolutely, without deviation, without compassion, without the human weaknesses that had led me into the basement. I would become exactly what the hospital wanted: a perfect observer, documenting its horrors without interfering, surviving through absolute compliance. The next 18 hours were the longest of my life. I spent them researching everything I could find about St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, digging through newspaper archives, medical records, and local folklore. What I found painted a picture of an institution that had never been entirely normal, even during its operational years. The hospital had been built in 1952 on land that had previously housed a Catholic orphanage, which had burned down in 1949 under mysterious circumstances. 17 children and 3 nuns had died in the fire, and there were reports of strange phenomena even during the hospital's construction. Workers complained of tools moving on their own, of voices calling from empty rooms, of shadows that didn't match the objects casting them. During its 56 years of operation, St. Catherine's had an unusually high mortality rate, even accounting for its role as a trauma center. But more disturbing were the reports from staff and patients of supernatural encounters. Nurses who saw patients in rooms that were officially empty. Doctors who heard medical equipment running in areas where the power had been shut off. And patients who claimed to be visited by family members who had been dead for years. The final incident in 2008 was barely covered by local media, but I found references to it in medical journals and paranormal investigation reports. On the night of October 31st, Halloween, of course, every patient in the hospital reported the same dream. They were visited by a child in a soccer jersey who asked them to help him find his way home. 7 patients died that night, all from causes that couldn't be medically explained. And by morning, the staff was in such a state of panic that the hospital board voted unanimously to close the facility immediately. But here's what really chilled me. In every account I found, in every report and investigation, there were references to security protocols and observational guidelines that were supposedly implemented to help the staff cope with the supernatural activity. The rules I'd been given weren't unique to the abandoned hospital. They were refinements of protocols that had been developed over decades of trying to coexist with whatever presence inhabited St. Catherine's. As the sun set on my second day away from the hospital, I made my decision. I would return, but this time I would be different. I would follow the rules with religious devotion, treating them not as guidelines, but as sacred law. I would document everything but feel nothing, observe everything but interfere with nothing, survive everything but learn nothing beyond what was necessary for continued survival. At 9:45 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital for what I hoped would not be the last time. The building looked exactly as it had 3 weeks earlier, dark, abandoned, wrapped in shadows and decay. But I could feel its attention focused on me as I approached, could sense its evaluation of my resolve and my commitment to the rules that govern our relationship. My keycard worked this time. The doors opened without resistance, and the emergency lighting welcomed me back like an old friend. But as I walked through the familiar corridors, I noticed changes that hadn't been there before. New graffiti on some walls, written in languages I didn't recognize. Fresh flowers and vases that hadn't been there during my previous shifts. And everywhere, the sense of increased activity, as if my brief absence had allowed the hospital's supernatural inhabitants to become bolder, more active. At exactly 10 p.m., I took up my position in the security office and began my rounds. But this time I was different. When I heard the music box playing Fur Elise from the pediatric ward, I documented it without emotion and moved on. When the third floor activity began at midnight, I recorded every sound with clinical detachment, ignoring the child's crying that had nearly broken me before. When I saw figures in the corridors, I looked through them as if they were made of glass. The hospital tested me throughout the night, presenting scenarios designed to trigger my human compassion and curiosity. A woman's voice calling for help from a locked patient room. The sound of a code blue being called over the hospital's defunct PA system. The sight of what appeared to be a lost child wandering the halls in a hospital gown. Each test was more elaborate, more emotionally manipulative than the last. But I had learned my lesson in the basement chapel. These weren't real people in need of help. They were manifestations of something that fed on broken rules and violated protocols. So I observed, documented, and survived, becoming exactly the kind of security guard that St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital required, a witness to its impossible existence, a chronicler of its supernatural activities, and most importantly, a participant who knew his place in the hierarchy. As dawn approached, I realized that I had succeeded. I had passed the hospital's final test, proven that I could maintain perfect compliance even after seeing the consequences of rule breaking. The building's atmosphere had shifted subtly throughout the night, from testing to acceptance, from evaluation to grudging approval. At 5:58 a.m., my radio crackled one final time. Night shift complete. You have learned. You may continue. This time, the voice was neither Marcus's nor my own. It was older, more tired, tinged with the weariness of someone who had been giving the same message for far longer than any human lifetime should allow. As I prepared to leave the building, I understood that I had become part of something larger than myself, something that stretched back through decades of night guards and security personnel who had all learned the same hard lessons about survival and compliance. I've been working at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital for 6 months now. I follow the rules perfectly, document everything faithfully, and maintain my role as observer rather than participant. The pay is excellent, the hours are consistent, and I've never had a performance review or surprise inspection. As far as employment goes, it's everything I could ask for. But sometimes, during the quiet hours between 2 and 3 a.m., when even the supernatural activity dies down to a whisper, I find myself wondering about the other guards who came before me. Where are they now? Did they eventually find peace and perfect compliance? Or did they discover that some rules are meant to be broken, regardless of the consequences? And sometimes, when I'm documenting the sounds from the third floor or noting the movement of shadows and empty doorways, I wonder if the real horror isn't the supernatural activity itself, but the ease with which I've learned to accept it, to live with it, to become complicit in its perpetuation. But these are dangerous thoughts, the kind that lead to rule breaking and termination. So I push them aside, focus on my documentation, and count the hours until dawn. Because whatever else St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital might be, whatever cosmic horror it might represent, it's also my job. And in this economy, a steady paycheck is worth almost any amount of psychological trauma. The question I leave you with is this. If you were offered a job with excellent pay, consistent hours, and the only requirement was to ignore the impossible things happening around you, would you take it? Would you be able to follow rules that defied logic and morality if it meant financial security? Or would your human nature eventually override your survival instincts, leading you down the same path that claimed all the guards who came before? Think carefully before you answer, because St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital is always hiring, and they're always looking for someone who thinks they can do better than their predecessors. The rules are simple, the pay is excellent, and the position offers unparalleled job security. After all, once you start working the night shift at St. Catherine's, you never really leave.